Hello everyone, we are still in London. I'm not sure I would call him an old friend, but he's someone I've known for a while, an acquaintance, and as it happens we grew up on the same street in northwest London, Thornton Way in Hampstead Garden suburb. Martin Wolf is one of the world's most famous economists. He's certainly the most famous economist ever to grow up on Thornton Way in Hampstead Garden suburb. And Martin, you have a funny story about how you went from North London to South London.
Yes, I do. For anybody who's not a Londoner, this would seem rather an obvious thing to do. You move from one part of your city to another, but in London, the Thames is sort of an absolute psychological barrier. North and south should never meet. So the idea that someone would move from north to south seemed completely outlandish. And so it would have been for me, except that I moved after I was at University at Oxford to Washington, where I worked for 10 years at the World Bank. I was there with my wife and we had to decide where to go back to when we came back to London. And we decided that South London, Dulwich where we live, was perfect because above all, the houses were cheaper and it gave my wife a decent distance from my much-loved mother, who could possibly be a bit interfering. And so we managed it, and it was no great difficulty at all, to our surprise.
In terms of this conversation, I don't want to make it about London. I want to make it about the middle of that sandwich between North and South London, which is Washington, D.C. You went to Washington, D.C., as you noted, after university, and you didn't stay, Martin. You're very unusual in that sense. Most English people, like myself, in fact, go to America and stay. Why didn't you stay?
Well, I never intended to. The World Bank is a strange sort of place to work at because it is an international organization and you work on foreign countries, on developing countries. So while I was in Washington, I wasn't really of Washington, and nearly all my friends were not Americans. There were a few Americans in the World Bank, of course, but there were people from India, Africa, everything else. My wife was English. We had 2 children while we were there. And I was coming up into my 30s, and we both had to decide where did we want our children to grow up and where did we feel most at home. And the answer to both questions was London and England. So I found it very easy. I never wanted to stay in America. I respected and admired it in many ways, but I never felt truly at home.
What years was?
I was in Washington from 1971 to 1981, and this coincided perfectly, almost perfectly, with the presidency of the World Bank of a very famous American, Robert McNamara.
Who, of course, was also very famous for his management, or perhaps mismanagement, of the Vietnam War.
Yes, indeed. And some said that he went to the World Bank to, as it were, launder or improve his reputation. I got to know him reasonably well, considering I was very junior, because I was the senior economist for a while on India, which was then, before China rejoined, the most important member of the World Bank. And I realized that he was a truly remarkable man with a truly remarkable American can-do spirit, but his judgment was not impeccable. He had some pretty obvious mental flaws, which I think were rather similar to those, or probably essentially the same as those which he displayed when he was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. In particular, the idea that quantitative measures and limitless resources would achieve anything. And I discovered while I was at the World Bank that neither was true.
I saw McNamara, or at least I saw his grave a couple of months ago. It was at Arlington Cemetery. He's buried a few feet from RFK and a little bit more from JFK. But it's interesting that you don't talk about the America of the 70s. You talk about the World Bank. It's almost as if, Martin, you were in DC in a kind of global bubble. What was America like in the 70s? This was the period of stagflation. You were an up-and-coming economist. Surely this was fascinating for you.
Well, that's a different point, and I think that is very important. Indeed, I've written about that very recently in a column, to try to explain to myself what I see as the collapse of American civilization, and particularly its political civilization. So apart from working at the World Bank, which was seminal, it is how I began to understand the world economy in a way that I could never have done otherwise. But of course, this was the time of Nixon, Watergate, wage price controls, inflation, the oil price shock, and going through Gerald Ford after the impeachment, or the near impeachment or resignation of Nixon, then Gerald Ford, then Jimmy Carter, and I basically left as Ronald Reagan was coming into power. So it was a period of enormous political and economic, geopolitical upheaval. In many ways, the period of my entire life most similar to what we're seeing today. The big difference, which is what I commented about in my column, was that when it became obvious that Richard Nixon had really been very naughty and broken the law and had people break the law on his behalf, I actually bought a television, the first television I ever owned, to watch the House Judiciary hearings on what had happened. And what impressed me most about this is that they were actually looking at the evidence. They were all looking at the evidence, and the Republicans, Nixon after all was a Republican president, were very clear that, well, if he'd actually broken the law, this was an impeachable offense, and they would bring the case before the Senate, and they did. And it became obvious to everybody that he was going to be convicted, which meant, of course, a bipartisan process, genuinely bipartisan. And he went. And so to me, that demonstrated that despite all the difficulties and pressures and his immense position as president, 1-2 terms, that they believed in the Constitution, that was bipartisan, and they carried it through, and they got rid of him. And that was, to me, incredibly uplifting and inspiring. So I didn't stay in America, but I thought, well, at bottom, this is a pretty solid constitutional setup with a solid set of values to back it. And that I took away with that, and I don't think it's true anymore.
I want to get to that in a second, but the solid constitutionality of the US, of course, is a manifestation perhaps of its modernity, always a model for many other developing and developed democracies. What about in economic, cultural, and social terms? You spent 10 years in America. I assume you escaped DC occasionally. Was America at that point in your mind, or when you think back, the model of modernity?
Very interesting question. First of all, it was completely obvious to me at that point that race was a very profound divisive issue. I came there more or less at the same time as the great race riots of the late 60s and early 70s. Washington was a deeply racially divided society with a very, very high murder rate, mostly black on black. It was obvious as soon as you went into the South how racially divided the country was. And what also struck me as I went around the country is that though there was obviously enormous wealth, there was also quite striking poverty, which I found quite a shock, particularly once you got away from the richer parts of the richer cities. I was struck, in addition, by the entrepreneurship, the innovation, which you could see everywhere, though this was a pretty difficult period for the United States. Nonetheless, this was there. And of course, you couldn't get away from this sense of the immense power of the United States. Washington was clearly, in the obvious way, the capital of everything. Despite the difficulties of the United States at the moment, one could almost feel the power around one. So I got it, but it never felt like home. And that's probably because America is so new and so obviously abrasive, and I rather like the old and the less abrasive, which is Europe, and so I feel more at home here. That's very much personal. It's nothing else than that. But America has always meant a great deal. My father admired it enormously as a refugee from Europe, and I've always admired it until relatively recently immensely.
I want to get to that in a second, Martin, but what most surprised you about America? You noted race. I assume you grew up with some knowledge of the US, television, radio, history books. Were you surprised by the racial inequalities and tensions in the US of the 70s?
I've always said this many times. I read a lot, obviously, in my sort of life. There's a huge difference between what one knows from reading and experience, something that one's actually experienced. So no, I wasn't surprised in the sense I knew American history, I knew about the Civil War, I knew about Jim Crow, and of course the Civil Rights Movement had just happened, so it was very, very live. I've already talked about the race riots. So I knew this intellectually, but just to experience when I walked sometimes into areas which were overwhelmingly black in Washington, that stage had one of the highest murder rates in the country, I could feel the tension. I could feel people looking at me who didn't feel very friendly towards me. This was pretty obvious, and I learned from my wife, who actually worked in the American government, that people who worked with her, black people who worked with her in her office, got very nervous when they crossed the bridge to Virginia. They were sensed insecurity. So it became personal in that sense. But of course, my world was entirely of middle and upper middle class professionals at the World Bank, but they were also outsiders, and I think they probably all felt much the same in different ways.
You've noted a couple of times already in this conversation, Martin, that you've fallen out of love with America. Maybe you weren't quite in love, but you had a deep affection for it in your first term in the 70s at the World Bank, and now something has changed. What's changed?
I think that's a very good question, and I must stress this is probably perhaps falling out of love is the wrong phrase. It's disappointment. It's that this is one of your great loves, and you decide, well, she's actually, as it were, not quite what I thought she was. So, which, by the way, in my personal life has never happened. Having been married forever to one person whom I met when I was very young. But in this, yes, because for us, as liberal, very passionately democratically oriented Europeans, my parents both refugees, survivors of the Holocaust. Most of their families were killed. America was the shining city on the hill, in the sense that it was the country that had saved them. Ultimately, it had liberated Europe, not just from the Nazis, but also from the threat of Soviet communism, which to them was quite real, particularly to my father, who was Viennese. So this was a country he loved, and in the post-war period, we all knew they'd made mistakes, but up to the mid-60s and the entanglement with Vietnam, it seemed that they made all the right decisions to save Europe, and we were very, very grateful and admiring of its commitment to democracy, commitment to freedom, and its support for those values across Europe. So it was deeply emotional, as I think it is for many Europeans even today. And what's happened since then, particularly more recently, looks like a sort of a betrayal of these values, of the basic constitutional values, of commitment to fundamental principles of the rules of law and constitutional order, to being the leader of the free world. All these ideas, which now seem terribly naive, almost ridiculous, but they were real to people of my generation. After all, I was born in 1946. So yes, there is a profound disappointment, and that's, I told you, that strangely, the 70s, precisely because it was such a mess, but the Americans got through it in the end quite well, sort of reinforced that belief in America, very widely shared, as I said, and that's made subsequent developments even more disappointing.
Do you think it's possible that part of that disappointment is a broader intellectual disappointment in modernity, in the project of modernity, which, as you noted earlier, America is the pioneer, the model for?
Well, I don't think... this is really difficult because I've been trying to disentangle my hopes and emotions from my understanding of what's been going on. I believe in modernity. Let me explain what I mean by it. But then the question I have to ask myself, was the thing I believed in actually always unworkable? And that's the horrible possibility. When I wrote my most recent book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, I still thought this is salvageable. It should be, it must be salvageable. And now I'm beginning to wonder. But what do I mean by the project of modernity? I mean intellectual, economic, cultural developments, probably starting with the 17th century. You could say it began a bit with the Reformation, but essentially which was built around the Enlightenment ideas of freedom of inquiry, freedom of opinion, scientific investigation, the accumulation of knowledge, the right of people to think for themselves in their own lives, and act for themselves in their own lives, making something of themselves, being free to make something of themselves in the market economy, and yet having social solidarity in a society which valued everybody and which was built increasingly around the ideas of democracy. So that seems to me what I thought of as modernity, modernism. It's pretty close to it. And I think from the left and the right, we've seen a colossal reaction against this over the last half century. Postmodernism, relativism, identity politics on the left, and an increasingly intolerant, socially authoritarian, even reactionary politics, nationalist politics of the right, which have consumed our societies, leaving where I am in what looks like an increasingly narrow no man's land between these two forces. Now, 40 years ago, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, that seemed inconceivable. It seemed to me that my version of modernism was precisely what the people in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union wanted. Democracy was triumphing everywhere. The modern market economy seemed to be what everyone believed in. It seems unbelievably far away now. So, yes, I still think that what I thought of as modernity is the best way to run societies and the best way for humans to be. But my view seems to be increasingly lonely in a world in which I see splits. Dominated by splits between deeply passionate people, with neither of whom, the left or the right, I have much sympathy.
Martin, you're a keen reader. I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to have a look at a new book by Ezra Klein called Abundance. It's the New York Times best-selling book this month. And there's an ongoing debate amongst progressives or moderate progressives in the United States now about why it's so hard to get anything done in America. Build new trains, fast trains, build new energy infrastructure, build new housing. Do you have a reading on that? Is there something uniquely problematic in America about getting new stuff done, building stuff, in contrast, of course, with China?
Well, that's A very interesting set of questions. So, first of all, I haven't read the book yet, though I'm aware of it.
I think you'll find it very interesting. In fact, you should probably review it.
But I plan to have a look at it. I probably have some sympathy with it. But what is interesting is that problem, the problem you described, seems to me